I'm very pleased at the hand of the Lord in our lives and your lives. I enjoyed listening to this. It's the first time I've seen this list of everyone, and it was very interesting, overwhelming almost, because there were so many people from so many places around the world, and if you're sitting here in Fredericksburg, you're thinking, well, the church in San Antonio obviously has put its footprints in many places, but it's amazing how God draws people together and builds relationship through the years. And we've been a part of Destiny Church for many, many years, and just very glad I remember the first time we came to Fredericksburg, we came to the Full Gospel Businessmen under James Engelman, who was head of the Full Gospel Businessmen in Kerrville, would set our schedule, and David Cook was doing a crusade in Kerrville at the Municipal Auditorium. And we'd been pastoring in Connecticut. We moved to San Antonio to attend the Bible school there. And I already had a degree, but I was pastoring, and I said, I missed out on something. I think I'm going to start all over, go right back to the mailroom and build up. And so we moved from Connecticut to San Antonio, and in doing so, one of the first things we found was God gave us a relationship with David Cook, and we began ministering throughout all kinds of churches throughout South Texas. And the Full Gospel Businessmen would arrange our schedule every week, and so that was fascinating for us. And now, Christy and I have been missionaries for over 40 years and in many different countries, but we lived in Africa and Europe for almost 40 years, and we lived in 5 different nations where we had residents. We were in South Africa, had a Zulu Bible college there. Then we were in Botswana and pastored a church in a big white tent in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. And we had 16 nations represented from all over the world, from Norway, from Australia, from all these places. And then we lived in Germany in the Black Forest, and we worked all through Europe and back into Africa. And then God began to turn our hearts toward Latin America, and we moved to London. So we lived in London for several years and also pastored a church, and it was an old church, but it looked like a cathedral, and it had a lot of the types of things you see going here, except 10 times more. We had huge stained glass windows, and it was beautiful. And then we also had all kinds of relics. It was an Anglican building, and we had Commonwealth Church right next to the U.S. Embassy in London, and that was very good. And then we worked in Ireland, and I worked as a chaplain on some of the biggest ships in the world, where I would go onto the ships working with the Seamen Christian Friends Society. That was interesting. Christy and I have had a life that's been quite amazing when you begin to look at how God opens doors. And as I began to look at all these missionaries, we've been to the fields of most of them, and it was interesting for us to see even the ones in Japan, the ones in all these different nations, and Taipei, and God is good. What I'd like to do, because I don't want to focus any more on that part, but I want to talk to you about how missions came into the heart of God and how God began to set everything in motion in order for the whole thing to happen. And so I'd like for us to look to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first few verses of chapter 3. And I'm reading it out of it's called the English, let's see, which translation? I think the English Standard Version, but but basically it says it interestingly. It says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under the sun, a time to be born, but then there's also a time to die." We like the born part, we don't like the dying part. It's a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, but also a time to heal. And if you look at these things, they have parts of each one that we love. We feel more uncomfortable with the part that it contrasts with. But it's interesting because God set everything into motion. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and also a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, and a time for war and a time for peace. God sets everything into motion. And as he does that, then he wants us to recognize, I was talking to my brother yesterday. My brother has been here to the church, but he's lives in Annapolis, Maryland, and he's struggling right now. He had a medical problem that developed last week, and he was kind of feeling really awkward and like it's a tough situation getting through what he's going through. And I began to talk to him about a time for this and a time for that. And it is really the way life is. And it's important for us not to automatically assume it's always the positive. Sometimes you go through the struggles. Sometimes you die. Sometimes you heal. Sometimes there's a killing. And sometimes we experience all these things. It's important for us to strike a balance. Now, in the book of Ecclesiastes, let's see what verse it is. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11. I want us to look at that. Chapter 3, verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. So there are a lot of things that happen in this world, and it's important for you to recognize God's busy taking care of all kinds of people, doing all kinds of things. Now, in the book of Matthew, it starts off, and it talks about how the Beatitudes. But then, after it finishes on the Beatitudes, Jesus talks in the Sermon on the Mount, he talked about how that we are witnesses and how that we are salt and we are light. We're salt to the earth, and if the salt has lost its flavor, talks about us not losing our flavor. You know you're salt. You've heard that in the scriptures. But don't lose the flavor that you've got. Don't lose the skip in your step. Don't lose the beauty of what God has planted in your heart. Keep it fresh. Keep it alive. Just because you're getting older and just because the physical body is getting older doesn't mean you're supposed to forget about all the beauty of flavor that he's given you. Every one of us, everybody smile at me. If you've got a smile in your life, it's amazing because that can say, it's a way of showing you haven't lost your flavor. God wants to keep us strong. And so as we look at this, we see that he's not only are we the salt of the earth, but we're the light of the world. And so he's giving us these little words so that we can recognize that he has something beautiful and something powerful to do in our lives. Now, in the book of Mark, chapter 16, and beginning in verse 15, it gives us the Great Commission. So, as he gives us the Great Commission, why he starts out and he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So I want you to notice two things here that God put into motion, like when we talk about a time for everything, there is the fact that he has established in us eternity. He put it in our hearts, this eternity that he's placed in our hearts. And as he's placed it there, then he also has given us the Great Commission. And there are reasons for that, and I'll show you in just a few moments what I'm talking about. And so as we look at this, I think about how that we're to go out and tell the world. And so the Great Commission, as we read that, it says that we are to go into the whole world and preach the gospel to every creature. And so as the Great Commission goes on, it's important to see how that we are to tell the world. And so every day I tell somebody about Jesus. I don't always wait for them to approve of what I'm talking about. Sometimes they'll say, oh yes, I'm a believer, I'm a Christian. Sometimes they look at you like a mule looking at a gate or something. They look at you really funny. And you don't have to wait around for them to tell you all the ways they agree or disagree with you. Just tell them. And you'll understand why I'm saying all that in just a few minutes. And so as I look at that, I realize that God has called us. First of all, he's already given us the field. He's already put eternity in their hearts, so they're able to grasp what he's going to do. But also, he has given you and I the responsibility to be witnesses, to tell them about Jesus. So, how beautiful, it says in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7, how beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of those who bring good news. I remember when we were in Thailand, and we were up in the mountains in Thailand, not too far from Chiang Mai, and as we were in the mountains and we were teaching, there were about 70 leaders. These 70 leaders in a group of people, just about half the size of this church, as far as space, they all came in, everybody. The culture of the Asian is to remove your shoes when you enter a building. And so and in Japan, they'll have sandals that you can put on, or unless you bring your own. And so you take off your shoes because they've been touching everything out there that's dirty and not clean. And now you enter the house, you enter the building, and so you remove your sandals and you put new ones on. Well, in the case of Thailand, they don't have any fancy bunch of shoes that you can put on. They will remove their sandals at the entrance, and then they walk in barefooted. So I'm up here preaching and teaching these were all leaders, pastors of churches and evangelists and everything else, and I'm up there, and they have about 70 leaders, men and women, and they're all sitting there, and I see more toes than you can imagine. I see about 700 toes, and and all these people, as I'm looking at that, and I'm talking about how beautiful upon the mountain are the feet of those, I got this brilliant idea, and I said to them, I have a challenge I'd like to give you. After this service, after we get through with what we're doing now, could I meet every one of you, nobody exempted, outside, and I'll pick a clump of grass, and I'd like you to stand on that grass, and I'm going to take a picture of your feet. And I said, would you mind doing that? And they all looked at each other and they said, no, we don't mind. We'll do that. That's no problem. So I met everybody out there, and I picked this nice big clump of grass because there were a lot of areas there was no grass. And so I picked this nice big clump of grass, and I said, I want you to stand on that. And so then I just snapped a picture. I'd love to take a picture of their face, but it's their feet I wanted to see. And so I took a picture of 70 sets of feet. These people wear flip-flops. Believe me, if there is torture to feet, it's going to happen as they climb through the bushes, as they go from all up and down the hills. And here they are with all these feet. And I'm telling you what, and so then what I did is I came back to the States. What am I supposed to do with this? And so I took my board, I had a mission board, and I lined it with pictures of feet, the whole thing. Well, I'll tell you what, that was a good experience. And I thought about how Don Richardson wrote a book, and he called it Eternity in Their Hearts. And in that book, he talks about people all over the world who have come from all kinds of different cultures, and how that many of them had a knowledge there was a God. There was one God, not multiple gods. There was one God. And this was long before the missionaries came. And now, how are they supposed to live life? Because they knew there was only one God, but they just didn't have anybody who could tell them. Well, as he wrote this book, I think about when God made man, here you were, every one of you. There was a table. God was the creator. He made you, but you haven't breathed yet. You're just laying there on this table. And you're like a duffel bag, and he's about to zip you up. He's put your lungs in and your liver in, your spleen. He's put your appendix in. He's got all the stuff. He's thrown all kinds of nerves and blood vessels, and all this stuff is in here. It's a mess, except he knows how to get it all in order, right? But before he zips you up, he puts a vacuum, as if we had a plastic bottle with no water in it. He takes this vacuum and he sticks it right in the middle of your chest. And it's an empty spot. And then when he gets that all in place and gets everything hooked up, he zips you up, and that's it. And then he breathes the breath of life into you, and he sends you on your way. Well, I think about that, and in that empty spot, he's given you, in your vacuum, he's given you the feeling of emptiness. He's given you the feeling of loneliness. It's in there. How many of you have ever felt lonely? Okay, he's given you deep frustration. It's there. Anybody ever felt deep frustration? What am I going to do? And then there is guilt. Anybody here ever felt guilty? Raise your hand, please. Just throw your hand up if you ever felt guilty. A sense of failure. He's put your dreams there. He's put even your faith is there. But that's that big empty spot. And so your Creator left his fingerprints on you. And from the beginning of time, man has tried everything in the world to fill that empty spot. I may not know much about my spleen, may not know much about my liver. I may not think very much even about my heart or my lungs. But I want to tell you something. I know what that emptiness feels like. There have been times I felt so empty and so guilty and so frustrated. And if you've ever felt that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so, what do we try to fill it with? We try to fill it with drugs, with sports, with sex, with entertainment, with work, with gambling, with greed, and every kind of relationship imaginable. We try to fill it up. But God wants to fill it up with himself. And you have to come to a place to where you say, it's like I call Brother Butch Newman, and his wife passed away several months ago, a year or so. And every time I talk to him, I hear him. He talks about, it's so lonely to come home at nights, and I'm alone just to come home at nights. But the rest of his life is full. But there's that emptiness that happens every so often. Now, the U.S. Center for World Missions in California, they put out a survey, and they put out a notice that 25% of all Muslims who come to Christ come having had a special experience that most people don't even know about. Muslims. And that experience is they will have a dream where Jesus appears, comes to visit them. 1/4, 1 out of every 4 Muslims, 1/4 of them had a dream before they ever came to Jesus. That dream, Jesus came, and I'll tell you a dream a friend of mine had who was Muslim, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. But they'll have that dream, and then the dream finishes, and Jesus does not change their heart. He only met them. He only talked to them. And then he sends them on their way, waiting for you to jump into action. And if you don't jump into action, this person will be left without an opportunity to come to Christ. He sets us up like in a basketball game where one man comes up and he puts the ball up there, and this other man comes up and dunks it right into the basket, okay? He sets you up to help you so that you can win the world for Jesus. That's the Great Commission. So, let me give you an example. We were ministering in Basel, Switzerland, and a friend of mine, a Swede, Dan Buckland, was pastoring. And so Dan has this very successful church. How big is the church? Well, members, they got about 25, maybe 30. They don't have many people who attend there on a regular basis. But every time they have a church service, there will be over 100 people or close to 100 people there. Every time. Now, what's that about? Well, they have all these visitors, like 3 times as many visitors as there are people who attend that church. How would you like that? That's just about where we are today. If all of you were members of that church, we'd have the whole place full with the same number of people we have here. So what happens is this church is a ministering church. You do not go to that church unless you're willing to work. Now, they're not saying you have to work. It's just everybody there has a heart to work. So what happens is they've got a refugee center down the road, and that refugee center involves whoever is having a worldwide battle. It could be Ukraine, it could be Eritrea, it could be Kashmir, wherever there is a hot spot in the world. Croatia at that time, Serbia, wherever there's a hot spot, they've got refugees in that refugee center out there. And those refugees have come and they're starry-eyed. They have no idea what's going on. The world has been upset. They don't know which way to turn. But they're here in this refugee center in Basel, Switzerland, and now this church goes to work. They go to visit them, and then they bring them to the church. And so when I would preach, and I've been there many times, and actually we attended there for several months where we were, our work was all over the world, but here we were sitting there many times, and where you've got, I'm up here preaching, but I've got to have an interpreter. And so my interpreter is helping. One of the groups of people out there, and there'll be 4 to 5 different languages who have to have interpreters to them. So the man who stands here, they've got somebody out there picks his words up, and then I can't preach very loud. The volume has got to be pretty low on my microphone because out there, one person's going to pick it up and others are going to be listening to him, and then they translate to the next. There's sometimes delays. Oh, it's amazing to do this. I've preached before with 3 interpreters before standing here with me. In this case, they're scattered, interpreters are scattered everywhere, and they've got groups of people listening to them. So you have them speaking in French, you have them speaking in German, you have them speaking in all kinds of languages. So as all of this is going on, it sounds like chaos. Well, sometimes it does have a moment that it is chaos. I didn't know who my interpreter was going to be. So I looked to Dan when he had me come up, and Dan called the name of a man, and he said, he's your interpreter. So I'm standing up here alone, then all at once my interpreter arrives. So I turned to him. I mean, you know, it's all informal anyway. I turned to him, I introduced myself, and then I said, where are you from? He said, I'm Persian. I'm from Iran. And so I said, okay, that's good. How long have you been a Christian? Well, 3 weeks. What are we going to be preaching to these people today? I'm thinking, but I didn't say that, but I thought that. And so this guy who is the Persian, I said to him, after the service, would you mind if you and I had lunch together? I'd like to talk. I'd like to hear your story. He said, okay. So after the service, after we had a very good service, very good time. And after the service, I sat down with him, and we were having lunch, and I said, tell me your story. And he said, a few months ago, I was back in Iran, and he said, I'm Muslim. My religion that I would grasp is not Muslim. My religion would be Zoroastrianism, which is like Cyrus in the Bible, because he was Persian, and so in the book of Daniel. And so he said, I was at home, I had my family. All things were very bad. And he said, as a matter of fact, it's resulted in my having to flee the country, take my family with me, and we came to Switzerland because we didn't know where else to go. And so we're here. But he said, let me tell you this. This happened to me. Oh, it was amazing it happened to me. He said, I dreamed one night I dreamed that I was standing in a big field, and there was a crater in front of me, and this crater, a meteor had fallen out of the sky, and it was so fresh, it was still steaming. And I saw the steam coming up. And as I saw that, as a Muslim, I'm looking at this, and I'm really thinking, what is this? And then all at once I looked up, and there's a man standing on the other side of the crater, and the crater was quite large. And I saw this man standing there, and he had red robes and sandals on. Immediately, he said, I did the sign of the cross on my chest. And he said to me, now he went through the whole experience with me, told me everything. They had a 15-minute conversation. He told me everything that was said between the two of them. He said, but I had this dream, and I see him, and so I did the sign of the cross on my chest. And when I did, he said, what is this that you do on your chest? And he said, it's the sign of the cross. Where did you hear this? Where did you learn this? And he said, and why do you do this? He said, well, I do this because you're Jesus. He said, but why do you do this? Or who taught you how to do this? And he said, well, the Armenians, kind of like Orthodox, almost Catholic, they taught me about this when I would see Jesus, or if I talked about Jesus, or was that in that sort of situation. And so that's why I do this. And Jesus says, Do not do what you do not understand. I thought that was interesting. And then he talked for 15 minutes with this Muslim guy, and then the vision was finished, the dream was finished, Jesus was gone, and he woke up. Well, he said, then I wound up with the political problems of my country, and I wound up fleeing here to Switzerland. And 3 weeks ago, I was walking down the street, and one of the men of this church said to me, out of the blue, would you like to come on a street corner? Would you like to come to Jesus? Would you like to make Jesus Lord of your life? And I said, yes. God has put eternity in your heart. Somebody has to tell you about him before you'll know he exists, before you'll change your life, before you'll think differently. We were in Thailand, as I mentioned, but at one point while we were in Thailand, we were ministering in a refugee camp that had the Karen people there. It's spelled as if it's Karen, K-A-R-E-N, but it's pronounced Karen, and they are from Burma. Back in 1989, the Burmese, who are a military junta or a regime that rules that country, it's a very evil government, and they changed the name of their country to Myanmar. The UN does not recognize Myanmar as a legitimate name because they said they are illegitimate government, the Burmese. And so it's called both. It's called Burma, it's called Myanmar. And so as all of this is going on, we were ministering to the Karen people. The Karen people, they're an interesting people, and they centuries ago, centuries ago, they began to publish that they believed there was one God, and his name was Yahweh. I don't know exactly the history of how they came up with that, but that's what they believed. They believed it so strongly that they were determined, and some of their people who were called prophets said things like this to them. They said, there will come a white man, and he will bring a book. And when he brings that book, from that book, he will tell you all about Yahweh, this one God. And so all the people were thinking this. 228 years ago, this is in the year 1795, there was a British diplomat who came to where these people were. 228 years ago. Long before they ever had missionaries, there was an English diplomat, a British diplomat who came to them, and they said to him, but he's a military guy. They said to this first white man they had ever seen, they said to him, did you bring the book? And he said, what book? And they said, the book that tells about Yahweh. And he said, I don't know anything about the book or Yahweh. Oh, they were so disappointed. But that's kind of how things have gone. Now, they've many times had missionaries. I don't know who the first white person was who took them the gospel, but they've had many missionaries since that time. And when we were there ministering to them, they were some of the nicest people you'd ever meet. Now, of all the cultures of the world, some of the nicest people I have ever met are Filipinos. And when we pastored in London, England, we had 35 Filipinos in our church. Boy, I'll tell you what, it's hard to just go out and have yourself a lunch without having been invited by a Filipino. The Filipinos would come up to us and say, could we take you to lunch today? Young ladies, young men, a couple of them get together and they'd say, can we take you to lunch today, Pastor? Off we'd go to some restaurant of their choosing. And it was very interesting. Some of the nicest people, and I could tell you stories about it. And we've been to the Philippines, but so many things, it's just an amazing thing when you realize all the different things that happen among people. And these Karen people were very much like them. The Burmese, it's a different story. Just last week, or a week and a half ago, a couple weeks ago, we were back home where we were living now in Sarasota, Florida. We met several different Burmese people. And it's interesting how all these different kinds of people and the different culture, the very, very different nature, but these people were just amazing. So I wanted to mention all of that. Now, I want to tell you a story. And the story involves Sydney, Australia. And and we were in Sydney just about 10 years ago. We were in Sydney, and it was an interesting experience. But when we pastored in London, down the road from us, there was a church, a Baptist church, and this church had a very interesting thing that started something for them. There was a man and the church is in Bournemouth, southwest of London, and this pastor, and his name is Francis Dixon. He is coming to the conclusion of his service, and a man stands up in the back and says, "Excuse me, may I give a testimony?" And they're coming to the conclusion of the service, and the pastor said, "Well, if you could make it brief, yes, we'd love to hear your testimony." And so the man said, this happened, okay? The man said, a few weeks ago, I was in Sydney, Australia. I was visiting with family. I was walking down George Street, which is a shopping area. And there was, out of the shadows of this entry to a shop, there was a man, a little white-haired man came walking out, and he said to me, "Sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven or would you go to hell?" That's all he said. I was so confused. Nobody had ever asked me such a question. And all the way back on British Air, back to England, he said, I was puzzled. I was bothered. I didn't know what to think about it. And this man's saying this to me. And so I came back and I called a friend because I was so puzzled. And I said to this friend, this is what happened to me on George Street in Sydney, Australia. What do you mean? What do you think it means? And this man was a Christian. And he said, well, I'll tell you exactly what it means. It means, do you know Jesus? Have you got Jesus in your heart? Because if you don't and you died tonight, you would not go to heaven. Oh, is that what it means? And this man led me to Jesus. And I've been sitting here in your church, and I've just wondered, could I come here to church? And everybody clapped, and that man became a part of that church. Well, this pastor, Francis Dixon, the next week was ministering in Adelaide, Australia. And he flew to Australia. And when he got there, there was a woman who came up to him and wanted to say something to him. And he said, before you tell me what you want to talk about, I would like to know how you came to Jesus. Are you a Christian? And did you come to Jesus? And how? And she said, oh, well, I was in Sydney, and I was on George Street shopping. And there was this little white-haired man, a short white-haired man, came out of the entry to the shop, and he asked me, ma'am, excuse me, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven or hell? And I was so confused. I never imagined. You know, folks, there are a lot of people out there that don't know anything about what you find so common and so normal. There are people out there have absolutely no history. This woman said, I thought about it, and I came back to Adelaide, and I came to this church, and I said to the pastor, because I knew it sounded like he was talking about something that this church would understand, so I came to this church, and I talked to the pastor, and he led me to Jesus. The pastor said, this is strange. This is Francis Dixon. 2 times in 2 weeks on different continents, I get this same story. And then he flew to Perth. And in Perth, he began to talk to the people. And this elder walked up to him after service. And he said, I'd like to take you to dinner. And this elder from that church in Perth, I'd like to take you to dinner. And he said, okay, so we sat down, and I said, sir, how did you come to Jesus? This man said, you want to, in other words, whatever they wanted to talk about, fine. First, I want to know, how did you come to Jesus? So he said, I'm sitting there with this church elder, and this elder said, let me tell you my story. I was in George Street in Sydney. And this little white-haired man came out of the shadows and he asked me, sir, excuse me, but do you know Jesus? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven or would you go to hell? And I got angry. I'm an elder of the, excuse me, microphone. I'm an elder of the church. What do you mean asking me a question like that? And it was just like I never said anything to the man. He never paid any attention to whatever I said about me being a church official. That didn't seem to mean anything to him. I came back and I went to my pastor and I said, the gall of that man. And he began to talk to him. And the pastor said, could I be perfectly honest with you? He said, yes. He said, you are in your position because you have such abilities as a businessman. But I've been worried about your spiritual condition for years. And he led me to Jesus. Well, I'll tell you what, folks, I thought, this is amazing. This is a true story. Everything I'm telling you is true. And so then he flew to London, in Keswick. He was ministering. And at the end of the service, he told the story. And 4 senior pastors, older men, came up to him after the service and said, we've been talking, and we've discovered that all 4 of us had gone to Sydney, and all 4 of us on different occasions had met this little short white-haired man. And he asked us the question. He did not do anything with it. He just asked them the question and let them go. You know, it's amazing. His next speaking engagement was in Jamaica. And a group of Baptist missionaries, 3 missionaries came up and said a similar thing. They'd gone to George Street. And as all of this is happening, he continued on to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, there are about 8 or 9 of these situations that I'm telling you about. So he continued on to Atlanta, Georgia, and the naval chaplain came up to him, and he said, I'd like to take you to dinner. And when he got me out to dinner, he said the first thing I asked him was, how did you come to? Well, I was in George Street. And 6 months later, the pastor flew from London to India. When he got to India, he was speaking for this huge convention of 5,000 missionaries. And as he was speaking to these 5,000 Indian missionaries, why the leader of the missionaries took him home with him, and they sat down and he wanted to feed him. He says, "What was your background religion before you came to Jesus?" He said, "I was Hindu." Hindu? Well, how did you as a Hindu come to Jesus? Well, nobody knows the evil, the wickedness I was involved in. But he said, I was an official with the Indian Diplomatic Corps, and I traveled the world. And as I was in all these different places, all kinds of things happened. But he said, you know what? It happened that we stopped on the ship I was in at that time. We stopped in Sydney. And when we stopped in Sydney, I decided to bring home gifts to my family in India. And I was loaded down with all these gifts. And there was this little white-haired man came out of the shadows on George Street. And he walked over to me and asked me this question. And boy, did it ever confuse me, because I didn't have a clue what he's talking about. He asked me, "Sir, excuse me, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven or to hell? Do you know Jesus?" And I was so confused, and I didn't have any, it's like he was speaking in German to me, and I don't know German. And so he said, I came back home, and he said, I went to my Hindu priest and asked him, what did this man mean? Please interpret for me. And he said, I don't know. So I suggest you go to the Christian missionary and ask him. And that's what he did. And he led me to Jesus. And now I am the head of these 5,000 Indian missionaries here in India. We all are very aggressive and active, touching the world. And he said, we've won tens of thousands of people to Jesus. Man, I'm telling you what. So this man, he said, I think I've got to go to Sydney. So he had an engagement, an invitation, and he said, I went to India, and he went to a suburb called Gamir in Sydney, and he said, first thing I said to the pastor, something's eating me up. I have got to ask you a question. Do you know of a little white-haired man who is a missionary on George Street here in Sydney? And that pastor said, yes, I know him. His name is Frank Jenner. Frank Jenner. And don't do it now, but you may want to write this down. You can Google Frank Jenner, and everything I've been telling you, the story is all there. But what happened is this. He said, I went, don't do it right now, because right now I'm going to talk to you for a few moments. I'm going to close this thing off here in just a few moments. But here's what happened. They began to talk. So he said to that pastor, is it possible I could meet him? He said, yes. And a couple days later, they went to Frank Jenner's house. Now, he said Frank Jenner is quite unable to continue this thing of ministering like he did for many, over 40 years. He was on the street there in George Street, over 40 years. But he said now he's got Parkinson's, and he shakes all the time, and he has a struggle physically, and he's had to basically retire from all of this. But he said, I would love to meet him. So they went to his house. They knocked on his door. Frank Jenner, Jenner, came to the door. And as he came to the door, this little white-haired man, just very short, very white-headed, he came to the door, and he even was this man was in the Navy. He was in the United States Navy at one point, and then he was in the Australian Navy for many years. He was even in England for a while. This man, he had been a naval man for years, and now he he said, they came to his house, and Frank Jenner said, could I, yes, come in, please. And could I give you tea? And they said, yes. And so he prepared tea, but he was shaking so badly that his tea kept spilling into his saucer. And so, but he sat there. He said, now, how can I help you? What is it you've come for? And they said, well, this pastor, Francis Dixon, said, well, I've been, and he told him about his experiences, about 9 or 10 experiences in many, many countries of the world, and how people just came forward and talked about a little white-haired man on George Street. And they told me this, and he told them all these stories, and he began to weep. As he began to weep, he said, I've been doing this for 40 years. I was not a good man. I was on the sea. I was in the ships. There was one man, I was so bad to him. And finally, even I recognized I had not been a good man to him. I just abused him. And I went to his house. And when I got there, I apologized because of everything I had done and how difficult I had been with him. And he forgave me and said, well, I'm a Christian, and I'd like to lead you to Jesus. And he did. As he led me to Jesus, it changed my life. And then I made a decision. I'm right here in Sydney. I will every day mention Jesus to 10 people. And in 40 years, I have never had any knowledge that I had succeeded with even one person. They calculated he had talked to between 100 and 150,000 people over those 40 years. But he had never had one time that he ever found out he had succeeded. And he said, today, you've made my day. This is wonderful. This is absolutely wonderful. 2 weeks later, Frank Jenner went to be with the Lord. 2 weeks later, he died. Well, I think about all this. And this morning, as we were driving up, we stopped at Starbucks in Burnie. I was getting a cup of coffee from a girl behind the counter whose name was Sydney. This happened this morning. And she's at the counter, and she gives us our coffee. And I said, young lady, I said, I've been to Sydney. You have? She said, I've never been to Sydney. My parents named me Sydney, but Sydney. But she said, I've never been there. It's my dream to go. I said, it's beautiful. You would love it. And I have friends in Sydney. And I said, we're on our way to Fredericksburg. Why are you going to Fredericksburg? I said, I'm going to Fredericksburg to preach about Sydney. And she said, what? You're going to Fredericksburg and you're going to be talking about Sydney, Australia? And I said, I absolutely am. I find it interesting that your name is Sydney. I said, could I tell you why I'm going to talk about Sydney? And in about 3 minutes, I told her what I've told you. And I couldn't do it in 3 minutes any other circumstance. But I told her about how this little white-haired man came out of the shadows and told so many people. And then I said, as I finished, and she interrupted by handing me the coffee, and we got everything, and we're now about to go out. And I turned to her and I said to her, Sydney, I want to ask you the question. Excuse me, but if you died tonight, would you go to heaven or to hell? And of course, she's an employee of a company. She's going to be very nice, not going to be confronting or anything. I have no clue where she is in her grasp of eternity. and she said something to me, but I couldn't understand. It doesn't matter. Because my responsibility is not that I get her on her knees right there at work and get her to talk to Jesus. I'm just planting seed. I'm just asking you to think about this. And when I left, I was under the impression that this girl was going to think about this. And then we said, goodbye. We got to go. And we got in the car and we drove away. So that was my experience this morning. And I'm just thinking about how you and I, all of us, have a responsibility to win the world to Jesus. And they don't know so many, for example, Frank and Christy are ministering in China and in Taipei or Taiwan. Well, they said most people don't know, most of them have never heard the name of Jesus. They don't know Jesus. They're Buddhist or they're something, whatever it is they are, or they're atheists, straight atheists, because the government is an atheistic government. But as they minister there, I think it's a wonderful place to know Jesus, and it's a wonderful place to minister to them. A few weeks ago, there was a young man came to our church in Sarasota, Florida, and as he came into the church, he didn't know Jesus, and he gave his life to Jesus. What we did not know is he was an English teacher headed for Beijing, and he now lives in Beijing. And he's been telling people, because he got saved in our church in Sarasota or Bradenton. He's now writing back about the people that he's talked to about Jesus. And he even has been saying to them, there's a TV program called The Chosen, and you need to watch that. And they're watching it. Are you with me? So to me, if there's anything I've got to say today, it would have to end with, I'm so excited about the assignment God has given me. And I'm really excited because for years I've been thinking, I've got to know, did they accept Jesus or did they reject him? Now I find out I don't have to know. I just say what I have to say. If they drop down to their knees and repent, great. Man, we've hit it. We've had a bingo today. We've really struck good. But if they don't and they look at me puzzled, it's okay. Because somewhere God's got somebody who's going to say to them, like the man on the street in Basel, Switzerland, would you like to receive Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? And they are, because of all the stuff that God's been doing in their life, they're probably going to say something like my friend did in Basel. Yes. And we'll leave it at that. Would you stand? I want you to take your right hand, put it over your chest. Father, I pray for every person here, wherever they are in their understanding of you, that you will reveal yourself to them and that you'll cause them to grasp the fact that you have placed eternity in the heart of every one of us. In Jesus' name, amen. If you don't know Jesus, please, today, where you are, you can come to the front, whatever you wish. But you need to acknowledge him in all your ways.